Good morning, afternoon, or evening, fellow diagnostic technicians. My name is Brin. I'm with Trained by Techs, and today we wanted to share a case study with you. The vehicle is a 2011 Chevy Aveo 1.6 liter and a loss of power complaint. This case study will be featured in Motor Age magazine in an article written by Brandon Steckler. Brandon Steckler is a good friend of mine, and I talked with him about this vehicle a few months ago when I was diagnosing it, and he felt like it was an interesting case and asked me at the time if I'd be okay with him writing an article about it for Motor Age. I was more than pleased with the idea of him doing so, so I told him absolutely, and he has written the article, and it highlights the benefits of networking, which ties really nicely in with this case study. I would encourage you to keep an eye out for that article. This vehicle was brought to us by a shop owner friend of mine who was working on it for a used car lot. He had no service history for the vehicle, but it came to him with a check engine light on and a loss of power complaint. The fault codes that were retrieved were some sort of exhaust camshaft sensor fault code. So his team replaced the camshaft sensor, but it did not resolve the loss of power or the check engine light or the exhaust camshaft sensor fault code. Upon further inspection, they found that one of the reluctor teeth on the exhaust cam was broken, so they replaced the exhaust cam, and I believe while they did that, they replaced the timing chains and tensioners, water pump, and exhaust cam phaser, because I believe they found that the phaser cam gear assembly had seemed to have been abused in the past, so they replaced that as well. Once they completed the vehicle, the exhaust cam sensor fault code no longer returned, but the loss of power or symptom was still present. They disassembled the engine a few times just to double check their timing, because they felt like the symptoms were that of a vehicle that was out of time, and each time that they disassembled it to check, they just seemed like everything seemed to be lining up the way it should. So and of course they were using the proper alignment tools. This entire time they were not getting any diagnostic direction from any kind of fault codes. I can't recall what he told me as with regard to what fault codes were he was experiencing, but he didn't seem like there was anything that was of any benefit to him. So he decided that it was time to bring it to me and let us see if what we could do for him. So when we received the vehicle, check engine light was on, and the next 3 pages are going to be the fault codes that we retrieved from the engine controller and the transmission controller of this vehicle. This one, of course, is the fault codes retrieved from the engine controller. The top 2, the P0010 and the P0013, intake and exhaust cam position actuator solenoid control circuit bank 1 fault codes. I'll tell you now that these were man-made. They felt like with these solenoids unplugged, the vehicle would drive better. And I'll touch on that in just a moment. But obviously, at a quick glance, that seems like that bit of information could be a clue. The P0101 mass airflow sensor performance and the P0106 manifold absolute pressure sensor performance, we felt like were most likely a symptom of the concern and not a cause. And then the P0700, of course, is a malfunction indicator lamp illumination request from the transmission controller. And then the last fault code retrieved from the engine controller was a control module communication bus off, which is the U0073 that you see here. Went into the transmission controller to see what fault code was in there that was causing the P0700 in the engine controller, and this is what we retrieved from there, which is a loss of communication with ECM PCM open circuit. So this fault code, along with this communication fault code, which obviously is also related to this P0700, we felt like those were certainly things that needed to be investigated, but they weren't on the high priority list as far as things to investigate immediately in attempt to resolve the loss of power concern. Certainly if we felt early on that we found something that proved that to be opposite the case, we were obviously going to be taking the time to investigate those. But no doubt they needed investigated, but at this point we didn't think that those were the first things to start to look into. Now, going back to the P0010, P0013, which again were man-made faults from them leaving these cam phaser solenoids unplugged, they felt like with those unplugged the vehicle would run better, and they left them unplugged to drive the vehicle to us. Now, obviously that could be a pretty important clue, and in hindsight it still may have been, but I didn't put much weight on it at the time because early on I realized that there were two severities of the loss of power symptom. The less severe symptom was what you would expect a vehicle to drive like if it had a restricted exhaust. At times it was more severe, where the vehicle would basically stall or almost stall anytime you tried to accelerate even a little bit. And we experienced both of these severities with the camshaft timing solenoids plugged in. It seems to me more dependent on temperature than anything, so we didn't put much weight in the fact that they felt like the vehicle ran better with these solenoids unplugged. So once we cleared the fault codes, we did drive it a bit, and like I said earlier, there was definite repeatable loss of power depending on when we drove it. It seemed like sometimes it was worse than others. So this data here, in the next few screen captures, are going to be us attempting to get a baseline at idle, the first few screen captures, and then off idle during a test drive on the following captures. But here, obviously at idle, stable idle, 735 RPMs, 98 degrees intake air temperature sensor, and the mass airflow grams per second at 3.12, engine load at 35. We felt like this 3.12 mass airflow grams per second was a little bit high for this 1.6 liter inline 4 engine at 735 RPM. And then looking here, accelerator pedal position indicated angle 0, throttle position indicated angle 6%, and here's what really stuck out at us. This is probably the biggest hint early on looking at engine data at idle. We see the manifold absolute pressure sensor PID 18.6 inches of mercury. Now, most of you are familiar with how to read map sensor data, but for those of you that are not, the map sensor reads absolute pressure in the manifold. What I mean by that is key on engine off and under wide open throttle situations where the pressure in the manifold is equal to atmosphere, you are going to read atmospheric pressure, which is 29.5 inches. So in order to determine what the actual manifold pressure is, you need to take the 29.5, which is your barometric pressure, and subtract the 18.6 displayed on the scan tool at idle, which if you do so, you'll find that the vacuum in the manifold pressure was 10.9 inches of mercury at idle. Some of you are aware that some modern cars are doing some interesting things with cam timing at idle to try to reduce pumping losses, and when they do that, manifold vacuum is not at the traditional 20 inches that most of you are aware of, that a normally good running engine should be. And we definitely put some thought into that, but early on we could tell that in this case that wasn't the case, that this thing did in fact just have low manifold vacuum, which indicated some kind of mechanical fault. But we wanted to back this scan tool data PID up, so we measured the voltage of the actual map sensor, and we also put a actual vacuum gauge on the intake manifold to verify that we were in fact getting less than 10 or 11 inches of mercury manifold vacuum at idle. Moving on, you can see here we are in closed loop, and the upstream O2 sensor is switching nice between 25 and 935 millivolts. The downstream O2 sensor is at a nice 735 millivolts stable. Short-term and long-term fuel trims seem to be pretty good, so it's certainly within fuel control. There's no serious, obvious concerns there. We wanted to test drive the vehicle, gather some data under wide open throttle conditions to try to kind of get a feel for the engine's ability to breathe. I'll apologize at this point. There's a few PIDs that I should have gotten and I did not. So we're missing engine RPM, which is obviously a huge data parameter that should be there, and absolute and calculated load pitch that should have been there. But either way, there's still some interesting things here. This was an during a wide open throttle attempt, and the cursor is at the peak of that attempt, which you'll see the top is 48.6 commanded throttle, and I wanted to kind of touch base on this later, but this is very interesting, this part here. Accelerator pedal position, it's showing 85.5 and 42.7. This was in fact pedal to the floor attempt, and you could see it plateau here at 85.5, and I'm not sure exactly why it did that. Some of our other data's parameter screenshots that will be displayed later are in the enhanced mode. We were looking at OBD2, or the global side of the scan tool in this case, so I'm not sure. This should be, I would expect this to be closer to 100%. For those of you that are not familiar with accelerator pedal position sensors on throttle-by-wire cars, so I don't want to steer you wrong with terms like always, but generally what I've seen is that one of the accelerator pedal position sensors is going to be half the value of the other, and that's typical, like you see here, 85.5 and 42.7. Obviously, during the wide open throttle attempt, we went to open loop drive mode. Intake air temperature sensor was falling due to the inrush of air coming through the mass airflow assembly. The engine coolant, you can see that it's up to operating temperature. You can see that our peak grams per second were 43.1. Now I know again that we didn't get engine speed, but I can tell you right now that this thing was not breathing. Obviously with 43.1 grams per second as our peak, it's not breathing. Back to this commanded throttle PID here. What's interesting is that this is the most that the engine controller would allow that throttle to open, and we thought that was very interesting considering we were trying a wide open throttle attempt type of test drive to see the engine's ability to breathe. At the time and in hindsight, we felt like this must be a strategy, but what was interesting is that the engine controller never coded through these attempts, and we made several of them. It would never allow it to go past 40-something%, in this case 48.6, and it was not coding during that time. We would expect that if there was some kind of strategy, that something that the engine controller didn't like with regard to some kind of correlation between MAF and MAP, that it may kind of restrict the throttle opening, but again, we felt like if that was the case, there would be some kind of evidence of that in a manner of a fault code. So we test drove the vehicle again, thinking that this thing was a cam timing issue, or at least feeling like, definitely an engine breathing issue, but potentially a cam timing issue. With the little history that we did know, we did wanted to take a look at the cam data PIDs. And this really here says it all. The top being exhaust cam angle, and then the third one here being desired exhaust cam angle. You'll see that both of those are 0 to 17 is the range, and they both mirror each other. And then intake cam angle here, the range you'll see is 0 to 14, and desired intake cam angle at the bottom, the range being 0 to 14. You'll see that both of those pretty much mirror each other. So we're not really seeing any evidence that that there is a cam timing issue as far as the engine controller is concerned. Otherwise, it would obviously have a fault code for it, but as well, we're not seeing an evidence of it with scan data. And this next capture here backs that up, with intake and exhaust cam variance being between 0 and 2 on the exhaust and 0 and 5 on the intake. These two last parameters were interesting to us as well. As you'll see that the exhaust cam command PID, which is displayed in percentages, you see that while I'm revving the engine, that the command is fluctuating relative to that engine rev, but the intake cam command is at a fixed 73% the entire time the engine's running. So we thought that that was interesting, and to be honest with you, we really haven't even investigated it. So if anybody out there is watching and they have any comments they want to share that would help us with that, we appreciate it. I'm sure it's some kind of strategy as well. I wanted to back up to during the attempt, wide open throttle attempt, to see the engine's ability to breathe under heavy loads. Some of you do the similar things with volumetric efficiency tests, and I know that there are parameters there that you utilize to help you kind of gain the same direction or idea of how to proceed from there. And volumetric efficiency is not necessarily needed to gain direction. You could basically watch some things like calculated and absolute load. Anyways, I still practice that, as many of you probably do, and I wanted to say at this point we were missing the engine RPM PID here, but we did punch the numbers in, and the volumetric efficiency was very low, and it wasn't until after then that we realized that the commanded throttle wasn't opening. So we felt like this is some kind of strategy, but we felt that was interesting considering it wasn't that there was no fault codes being retrieved throughout this process. But you're trying to punch in numbers to check volumetric efficiency, this is a perfect example of how that won't necessarily yield you the results that you're hoping for. We'll kind of recap real quick, and I'll do this throughout the case study presentation. The shop owner friend of mine felt like timing. We kind of felt like timing, or basically definitely an engine breathing issue. Manifold vacuum was obviously low. So we have a few things that we can put on the list of possible causes. Even though it wasn't coding for a cam crank correlation, and even though the data on the scan tool suggests that everything was good, we wanted to get a camshaft crankshaft correlation capture with our oscilloscope. It's easy enough. We went ahead and referenced service information and figured out where we needed to access those. But for those of you who are not aware with what this is, basically you acquire a signal from the crankshaft sensor on your scope as well as the camshaft's sensors, and you basically compare each individual camshafts to the crankshaft. And a lot of times you're going to need a known good capture to compare it against. Some sites, of course, are IETN waveform database, but as well there's some Facebook groups out there that are great resources. Sometimes the captures are stored, and if they're not stored, you can just ask if anybody has those captures. They may have them saved and just haven't uploaded them to some of those sites. But in this case, we were able to reach out to a friend named Matt Wallace. He actually had a 2011 Chevy Aveo with a 1.6 liter, so he told us that he would be able to get whatever we needed. After taking our capture, we did acquire his. This is ours, and I'll briefly kind of go over how this works. But with the Pico software, you have rulers and cursors, and the first thing you'll want to do is use these rulers here. You'll see with the bluish green little circles, and you'll put that. I won't say that this is top dead center, but usually a good reference point is the missing tooth in the crankshaft sensor waveform. And then every other missing tooth represents 720, or I should say, the next missing tooth segment in that waveform suggests 360. So if you skip that and go to the second one, that is 720, which you'll see the camshaft signals here in green and red the pattern is 2 short high pulses and 2 wide high pulses, and then it repeats over and over again. But during that 720, which is 4 strokes, of course, you'll see 1 revolution, if you will, of the camshaft sensor. So after we plot our rulers, it's at our reference points here, which is the missing tooth, and then again at 720 degrees thereafter, then you find, when you're referencing it against a known good capture, you just find a point on it that you can reference in the same place on the known good. So in our case, we put 1 cursor at the falling edge of the first short pulse on the exhaust cam, and then put the second cursor on the falling edge of the second short exhaust pulse on the intake cam. And you can see here that at 60.7 degrees is when that first falling edge of the short high pulse came after this 0 degree mark, and then the second short pulse falling edge of the intake cam sensor happened at 168.4. And the next slide, or next screen capture, is Matt Wallace's, and you can see his is at 58.4 on the exhaust cam falling edge, and then 164.1 on the intake cam, which is a difference of 2.3 degrees on the exhaust cam and 4.3 degrees on the intake cam. Not perfect, but pretty darn close. I mean, that's certainly close enough that the vehicle shouldn't be running the way it is. So here we are. We feel like there's a cam timing issue, but we're seeing no evidence of it. Most sane people would give up at this point, but we did discuss that we have other things on the table. I guess we're too stubborn to rule out cam timing at this point, but we could also consider that there may be some kind of intake or exhaust restriction causing the breathing issue. And being that this is a mass airflow car, fuel trims and data will look fairly normal if that's the case. And so with engine manifold vacuum being low, low breathing issues, we could have an exhaust restriction. So we figured the best next step is going in cylinder with a pressure transducer and getting a cranking compression capture. If you'll recall, our friend Matt Wallace said that he could get us anything we needed. He has the same car, so we asked him to get a cranking compression capture and supply us with that. So acquiring a cranking compression capture from our car, we can compare it to his, but we could also tell whether or not there was an exhaust restriction, looking for elevated pressures during the exhaust stroke. This capture here is our cranking compression capture, and I'll briefly go over this. I won't go into detail because again we need to keep this video kind of short. We encourage you to take some training classes on this, engine mechanical testing using pressure transducers. There are a lot of great instructors out there like John Thornton, Bernie Thompson, Scott Schotten, Eric Ziegler, and Brandon Steckler is another one. There are many out there, and I feel bad even naming those because I'm sure I'm leaving some out. But we would encourage you to attend those classes so that you can learn these techniques, because we feel like they're really cool. When you get good at them, there's a lot less guessing. You often feel like there's a mechanical problem and you have to disassemble the engine to verify it. Well, with these techniques, most of the time you can conclusively come up with the cause of the issue without disassembling the engine. Therefore, you can approach your customer confidently with the estimate for the job that's going to actually resolve their concern. But we'll briefly go over this. Most of you are familiar. These internal combustion engines, spark ignition engines, are 4-stroke, and you're familiar with the term suck, squeeze, bang, blow. So we'll start in the middle of this capture so we can kind of go over it in that manner, the suck, squeeze, bang, blow manner. In the middle here is 360 degrees after top dead center. Now the piston is at top because this is top dead center, but it's top dead center during the exhaust stroke. The piston is at the top. When it comes down in the cylinder towards bottom dead center, the intake valve should open up right about the 360 degree mark. And the entire time the piston comes down in the cylinder or descends in the cylinder, the intake valve should be open. So this part of the capture should basically be representing the pressure that's within the manifold, because the intake valve is open and the pressure transducers in the combustion chamber. From there, the piston goes from the bottom dead center to top dead center, and that is going to be your compression stroke. And during that stroke, your intake valve should close. So once your intake valve closes, then you should be building pressure in that cylinder as the piston comes toward top dead center. We're going to come back over here because this part of the capture here is the same as this. Once the piston is at top dead center, normally you would have combustion take place, and this stroke would be called a power stroke. But when we're taking these captures, we're generally disabling the injectors and we're removing spark so combustion doesn't take place, and this stroke for testing purposes is called the expansion stroke. The piston comes back down and decompresses what it built up. So it built up pressure during the compression stroke, and on the expansion stroke, it basically decompresses the pressure that it built up during the compression stroke. And during the expansion stroke, the piston is descending and going from top dead center to the bottom dead center. So before bottom dead center, you'll see a pressure change, and that is generally when the exhaust valve opens. So the fourth and final stroke is the exhaust stroke, and it starts at bottom dead center here and ends at top dead center here. Just before bottom dead center here, during the expansion stroke, the exhaust valve opens, and the exhaust valve remains open till, or close to, I should say, the end of the exhaust stroke, right around the 360-degree mark. So if the piston starts at bottom dead center and comes up in the cylinder toward top dead center and the exhaust valve is open and your pressure transducer is threaded into the spark plug hole, so it's reading cylinder pressures, but with the exhaust valve open, it's also reading exhaust pressure. So we alluded to the fact that our issue could be caused by a few things. One of them could be a restricted exhaust, the other being, obvious one would be timing. And we wanted to get the in-cylinder cranking compression capture because with a known good capture, we could check valve timing and compare it to the known good engine, but we could also check to see if there's any excessive exhaust pressures or back pressures that would indicate there's an exhaust restriction. So that's the 4 strokes from an engine displayed in a cranking compression capture. But for those of you that are familiar with these cranking compression captures, you'll tell right away that ours looks a bit unusual. Generally, you'll have, and I'll show you, this is more like what you'd expect to see during cranking compression. I'll show you the quick anomalies. If you compare the two, it pretty much looks like, if for some of you skateboarders out there, it looks like kind of like maybe a half pipe. There's not really any deep pockets in this section of the capture like you see here. Here you see a deep exhaust pocket during the expansion stroke, and you see a deep vacuum pocket during the intake stroke. And those are some of the odd things, weird anomalies in our capture. And of course, you don't know whether it's known good or not until you have a known good. But again, our friend Matt Wallace supplied us with a known good. So as you can see, his capture looks completely different. But a couple things you'll notice: our cranking compression is 125.9, where his is 243.4. And that's substantial. Substantial difference. And so we'll go ahead and kind of cover some of the other things. I mentioned this is the point where the exhaust valve opens, and you'll see that the exhaust valve is opening 140 degrees after top dead center, which is referenced from here, the first top dead center in the capture. His is happening at 137.7 degrees. So very close. I wanted to touch on something real quick. Exhaust valve closing and intake valve opening is harder to kind of determine, where that's taking place. So for me, I focus on the exhaust valve open and intake valve closing. If you know when those are happening, you have most of what you need to analyze these captures. The thing that's different here is the intake valve close. Ours is at 616 degrees after top dead center, and Matt Wallace's is happening at 581 degrees after top dead center, which is about 34 degrees difference. During the compression stroke, the earlier the intake valve closes, the more pressure you're going to build in the cylinder. Well, his is closing 34 degrees earlier, and that's why you have 243 psi cranking compression, where ours has 125.9, because our intake valve is closing 34 degrees late. And if it's closing 34 degrees late, then it's opening 34 degrees late, and that's why you see this deep vacuum pocket. Again, the piston is at top dead center. At the end of the exhaust stroke here, it's descending or coming down toward bottom dead center in the cylinder. The intake valve should have been opened, but it's not because it's opening late, and that's why you're seeing this vacuum. The piston is coming down against a closed intake valve, which is producing a low pressure in the cylinder, and that's why you have that anomaly. So here we are. No codes for cam crank correlation. Engine data suggests that the cam's in time. When we scope the cam and crank sensor and see how they correlate to one another, comparing it to a known good capture, everything looks good. But when we compare cranking compression capture to a known good, we can see that our intake cam timing about 34 degrees late when compared to a known good car. So I'd encourage you to take a moment, maybe pause this demonstration, and kind of consider what you think could be causing this. So basically we're in the same position you were. We were trying to decide how intake valve opening and closing events were happening 34 degrees later than they should when we're not coding and scan data suggests that we're in time. I forgot to mention that my friend did replace the intake cam phaser during one of those times where he was verifying that his timing marks were lined up and that I guess the intake cam phaser had experienced the same type of abuse that the exhaust cam phaser had, so he was concerned with its condition and replaced it as well. And they were genuine parts. Exhaust cam replaced because of the broken reluctor. We had a genuine exhaust and intake cam phaser replaced. And we have timing components in. They checked the timing with the appropriate tools. We checked part numbers for the phasers and images as well, and we could tell that those appeared to be right. What other things could we be looking at? We have possibly the reluctor. Maybe the reluctor's in the wrong position. Some of you might be thinking that the phasers are not necessarily keyed right, or there's a pin shear in the cam or something like that. Well, some of you are not familiar with how these systems are, and I pulled up service information here. This is referenced from Identifix. With regard to reluctor, this is a bad picture, but you can see here on the back of the cam is the reluctor for the intake and the exhaust cam, and they're pressed on. So some of you might think, well, maybe that reluctor is not timed properly, but keep in mind that when you're using the timing tools, you use an actual flat bar to lock the camshafts themselves in place, and then you use this device here to lock the phasers in place. Now, you're talking about potentially pin shear. These phasers are not pinned to the camshaft. You have to use these tools to get everything timed, and my friend checked it 2 or 3 times, and we checked it once, and everything was lined up. If you're thinking about reluctor, maybe the reluctor had shifted. Again, the cams were locked, the cranks were locked, so the cams were in time and the phasers were locked in place before bolted to the cam. So everything there is in time. If the reluctor had spun, let's say that it overheated, it's like some of the GM engines out there that overheat and the reluctor spins. If the reluctor had spun, the actual intake and exhaust valve events would be right, but you'd be coding for cam and crank correlation fault. So that couldn't be it. The phasers were new, they were genuine. I had mentioned me and my friend had double and triple checked these, the alignment of these phasers, in relation to the camshafts. The camshafts and the crankshaft was locked in. This is where the networking came in. Well, the networking came in with our friend Matt Wallace providing some known good captures, but also just kind of talking through this with other diagnostic technicians. A friend, Justin Miller, another trained by tech, and Brian Collada, discussed it with them a little bit, and of course Brandon Steckler, who I mentioned earlier, and we basically all agreed that it must have the wrong intake cam installed. So it was time to do a little investigation. We looked at the cam itself, tried to find casting numbers, and tried to see if we couldn't verify what cam was in the car. We weren't really coming up with much that was helpful. The casting numbers But what we found is the number was the exact same as the one that was displayed on the exhaust camshaft, so not very helpful. So we decided it was time to kind of investigate, look at other cranking compression captures at model years older and newer than what we were dealing with. And what we did find was there was a known good cranking compression capture on IATN. It was put on there by a gentleman named Gary Williams, and it was known good from a 2009 Chevy Aveo with a 1.6 liter. And displayed for you is that capture, and we've annotated it. This is the known good cranking compression capture from the 2009 Chevy Aveo with a 1.6 liter. And as you can see early on, this resembles or looks pretty much exactly like my capture from my 2011. You can see my capture has 125.9 psi. His has 133.9 psi. His exhaust valve opened at 143 degrees. Mine opened at 140 degrees. My intake valve closed at 616 degrees, where his closed at 611. So basically, the exhaust valve and the intake valve events were happening at the same time as this known good capture from a 2009. So this told us right away we were most likely looking at the fact that we had the wrong intake cam in our car, and it was probably one for a 2009 model. So we called our GM parts distributor and we asked them to check the part numbers for a 2009 intake cam and the 2011 and make sure that they were different, and they said that they were, so we ordered an intake cam. So we removed our intake cam after we got the new intake cam, and in front of you here is the results. We stood them up side by side from the rearward angle, and you can see the one on the left is our intake cam we removed from our vehicle, and both captures show that the final or the rearmost cam lobe pointing almost at 12 o'clock position. You can see that the first, or the small reluctor trigger here, is approximately in the 11 o'clock position. When compared to the new cam or the correct cam, it's pretty much lined up with the cam lobe. You can also see that the notch in the back of the cam where the timing plate, locking plate goes, is not quite 12 o'clock, just before 12 o'clock, basically vertical. And you can see on the new cam that the angle of it is pointing roughly toward where 1 o'clock would be. So the two differences being that the reluctor position on the cam is different, but also the notch for the timing plate is different. So we replaced the cam and wanted to share the results with you. So this is our scope capture, cranking compression capture after replacing the intake cam. As you can see, this thing looks a lot more like Matt Wallace's known good capture out of his 2011. Our cranking compression is way higher than it was. It was about 125 psi. Now it's at 221 psi. Our exhaust valve opened at approximately 140 degrees after top dead center compression, and our intake valve closed happened about 579 degrees after top dead center compression, which it was closing at about 615 degrees. Now our vents are taking place or happening at the right time. Our capture looks right, our compression's right. The vehicle did drive wonderfully after this. But we also wanted to show you the post-repair scan data captures. This capture here is desired versus actual intake and exhaust cam. You could see that they weren't bad to begin with, because as far as the engine was concerned, everything was in time. But you can see here that they're perfect, working order there. Here, this was actually during a VE test drive. The engine RPM did peak out at 6,299. The mass airflow grams per second peaked at 80.74. Engine load peaked at 100 easily. APP indicated angle looked great, peaking out at 100. Throttle position indicated angle is great now. Instead of peaking at 48.6, we're at 100% during the wide open throttle. And intake manifold pressure was reading more appropriately. So we punched this numbers in on ScanShare's volumetric efficiency calculator. This is a good calculator because it takes baro into account and it's accurate. So we have 6,299 RPM, 80.4 grams per second, 110 degrees intake air, 29.4 baro, and 1.6 liter engine, and now we have 86% volumetric efficiency, which is certainly good for this engine. For those of you that are not familiar with ScanShare, I would recommend checking that out. It's a very interesting site, very cool site. It came about from Jim Wilson, the flatrater.com days. Basically what that was, a case study with interactive scan data type of website, and you could subscribe to it. And so early on in the case studies, they'd tell you the fault codes and the symptoms, and then they would supply you with scan data that you could manipulate, and you could start making decisions on what next step you would take for trying to pinpoint the cause of the concern. And then you'd look at the next part of the case study and see what they did and the results from the scan data, and eventually toward the end you'd find what the resolution to the concern was. So that's Jim Wilson's flatrater.com, which is now called ScanShare. It's a subscription-based website that you pay for, that has this calculator. It has those case studies, but it also has known good, I shouldn't say known good, it's got known good and known bad scan data captures in there. So for those of you that are diagnosing cars regularly, you know how valuable that can be. So pretty cool site. I would recommend that you check it out. But anyways, this concludes our case study demonstration. We're pretty proud of it. We're pretty excited about this diagnosis, and so we wanted to share it with you. Hopefully some of you benefit from it. Any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to post them. We do enjoy reading them, and we do honestly believe that they bring value to these demonstrations. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.